So, good morning, everyone. Great to have you here. It's a fine September day, and hopefully it'll stay that way through the weekend. At any rate, we've got a great lineup today. Really honored to have Bob Howarth here, the Atkinson Professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell. And Bob also is a member of the New York State Climate Action Council, where he played a leading role in making sure that the recommendations that came out in the scoping plan got us headed in the right direction. And now it's up to us to make sure they stay headed in the right direction. And that's what I'd like to talk about in the second part of our meeting today. But at any rate, it's great to have you here, Bob, again. Really appreciate your carving out the time from what I know is a busy schedule.
Thank you.
Kind of living in the pressure cooker these days.
Well, things are starting to relax a little bit. I'm actually very pleased to be able to talk to this friendly and well-known audience of friends. Shall I get started?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Well, thank everyone who's here this morning. It's a beautiful morning. Peter asked me to just review a little bit about methane and what Tony and Graffy and I and others have been doing and saying about methane for going back 14 years now, but also sort of remind you a little bit about blue hydrogen and the work that I and others have done the last few years on that. And then most recently, I've been working on liquefied natural gas exports from the US. So he asked me to cover that a little bit too. So I'm going to do all of those and give you a little bit of a mix of the up-to-date science and a little bit of the politics here and there. So just to remind you, if you don't think about methane.
You're not going to want to listen to this, but I'm going to just leave
it. If everybody could make sure you're on mute, I'm going to go ahead and track that down.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
No worries. This is the atmospheric concentration of methane going back to early 1980s and right up to about a year or so ago. And what you see is that methane used to be rising rapidly in the atmosphere in the 20th century. It was actually flat for the first decade of this century. And it's been rising again rapidly since about 2007 or 8. There's still a tremendous amount of debate among scientists as to what's driving that increase, but my own research suggests that at least a third of the increase since 2007 is due to growing shale gas in the United States and the United States alone. So if I'm right, the US is alone is a major player in this increase. And methane matters. A lot of us have been saying that for quite some time, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying so for quite some time, but they've gotten stronger in their messaging. So this is from the latest synthesis report, 2021, 2022. And let me just walk you through this a little bit. What you're seeing here is as of about 10 to 15 years ago, this is the amount of net warming that the planet's had, 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline. And that's due to this action of warming gases minus cooling gases, basically. And this is, again, a little bit out of date already. The Earth now is about 1.4 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline. We're moving rapidly to 1.5 to 2. When you look at what gases drive this net warming, carbon dioxide is there at 0.75 degrees and methane is 0.5, adding up to that. Other things are really quite minor by comparison. So methane's important. Basically, what this says is that a third of all of the global warming that's occurred since the 1800s is due to methane. It's far from a trivial case. And if we want to keep the Earth well below 2 degrees Celsius, you can't do that with carbon dioxide cuts alone. You have to reduce methane emissions, and we're on the wrong trajectory. It's going up. And again, shale gas is certainly part of the reason for that. So again, if you don't think about methane and carbon dioxide too much, this is from an earlier IPCC report, but it shows the impact on temperature of various greenhouse gas contributors, carbon dioxide and methane, over a period of time into the future following a one-time emission. And you can see that carbon dioxide has a long tail there, influence well into the future. Methane really has no influence beyond 40 to 50 years into the future. And so when we compare methane and carbon dioxide, you have to decide on a time frame to do so. And I and an increasingly large number of other scientists are saying we should be doing this on the 20-year time period because methane has a huge impact on that time scale. And we need to really slow the rate of climate warming on the scale of the next 10 to 20 years. But commonly, and probably most commonly, people use a 100-year time period, which is way off scale over here. And what that basically does is ignore the early impacts of methane and underweights them. And we make those comparisons with what you call a global warming potential. It's either for a 20-year period or a 100-year. It's basically the action of methane as a agent of warming divided by that of carbon dioxide over that time period. And the values that I'm going to show you mostly today are for 20 years, and it's that value. It's about threefold lower if you take the 100-year time period. This 100-year time period is used by almost all governments, certainly by the US government, but it severely understates the damage that has been done in the past for methane to the climate. And the IPCC has specifically said it's an arbitrary choice. I think it's a wrong choice. The 20-year time period is used by the state of New York by law. That's in the Climate Act. Governor tried to get us out of that and go to the 100-year time period a year and a half or so ago, but she got a lot of pushback from a lot of people and pulled back on that. I'm really pleased to say that New Jersey and Maryland are also now using 20-year, and I think other states are catching on. I think other governments will, and that's what I use as well. Okay, so let me move on to blue hydrogen. And I never heard about blue hydrogen until 4+ years ago. And as Peter mentioned, on the Climate Action Council, the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of New York is the fossil fuels we use to heat our homes and commercial buildings. And the council recognized that early on, and we agreed we needed to get rid of that. In the end, what we said is we need to get rid of fossil fuels completely for heating, and we should move to beneficial electrification with heat pumps. But along the way, we had a lot of argument and debate, and industry reps from the natural gas industry said, what we really should be doing is using blue hydrogen. Forget heat pumps, they're too expensive, et cetera. We should use blue hydrogen. And I'll get into what blue hydrogen is in a minute, but it was being sold to us as having zero emissions or nearly zero emissions. And the idea is you could put this into the gas pipeline system either instead of or in addition to natural gas, which is wrong. Anyway, I got interested in looking at what the real footprint might be since it was being sold to us as zero emissions. And top of this is off of my slide. Hopefully you can see it. Doesn't really matter. The point here is that we've been making hydrogen from fossil fuels globally. We've been doing that for about 140 years. And in both the United States and Europe, it's almost entirely made from natural gas. 96% of the hydrogen made globally is from fossil fuels, and that's the same number for the United States in terms of natural gas. The methane in natural gas, and natural gas is methane, is the chemical feedstock for it. And you put that methane under high temperature and pressure and add a little steam, water vapor, and it breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And the heat comes from burning more natural gas. So natural gas is both the chemical feedstock and the source of energy for this. There's a lot of natural gas involved in making that. And that's an old process. Again, it's been around for 140 years, and the industry calls that gray hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is exactly the same, except industry says they'll try to capture that carbon dioxide that is made when the methane breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And this is a new concept. It really is less than a decade old as a thought. It's coming completely out of the oil and gas industry, and it's been very, very widely promoted by a group called the Hydrogen Council, which is set up specifically to do this by BP, Shell, Total, ExxonMobil eventually joined them, et cetera, over the last 7 years. Been tried twice only globally, in Texas and Alberta. And we have data on those efforts. So I worked with Mark Jacobson on this assessment. Mark's a brilliant engineer and, among other things, an expert in carbon capture, which I'm not. So I brought him in to help me with that. We published this paper a little over 3 years ago now. And as I say, it's one of the very few peer-reviewed papers out there looking at the greenhouse gas footprint of this blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen. It's one of the few even for gray hydrogen. And ours was the first, and still really, I think, the only reasonable paper to include methane in addition to carbon dioxide emissions. And this is one of our summary figures out of there. And we're here looking at the carbon dioxide emissions, including methane converted to carbon dioxide equivalents for traditional gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and then various fossil fuels. We're looking both at the carbon dioxide emissions, which are in yellow, and then the methane emissions associated with this converted to CO2 equivalencies, which are in red. And what you see is that the blue hydrogen footprint is less than that of gray hydrogen. So they're capturing some carbon. Carbon dioxide emissions are lower, but they're not zero. And I'll go into that in a minute why. The methane emissions are actually larger. And the reason for that is once you start trying to capture carbon dioxide, that's an energy intensive process. And they do that by burning more natural gas to provide the energy for it. And the methane emissions increase as a result of that. So regardless, the blue hydrogen hardly has a zero or near zero or even a low footprint. It's actually larger than the footprint of natural gas. One would be better off simply burning natural gas. Now, our analysis is very conservative. We knew industry wouldn't like it. We knew we'd be looked at very carefully. And so we kept it very simple, very conservative. And there are very few assumptions behind it. Just 4, really. I won't read what those are. We used the best available data for baseline analyses, but we also did some sensitivity analyses. And at the time for methane emissions, you can't develop and use shale gas without having some of the methane that is shale gas emitted unburned to the atmosphere. And we used a value of 3.5% for this paper. It's based on what was available in the literature at the time from airplane flyovers and from satellite data. I wrote a subsequent review paper in December 2022 summarizing those, but it's the same data. And I just want to, people talk about methane as leaks, and I just want to emphasize it's really not. There are leaks, but that's not the biggest issue. It's purposeful part of the routine operation of developing shale gas. And some of it is release of methane even before you hit a shale formation, just in the drilling operations as you hit pockets of methane on your way down from old oil and gas development and old coal mines. It's venting for safety reasons from storage and processing facilities. If you are releasing methane gas to the atmosphere and you burn it, that's bad. It produces a lot of noxious nitrogen pollution and things, but it burns most, but not all of the methane. And those flares often go out. So again, that's not a leak, but it's a big source of methane. Pipeline compressors that pressurize the gas to get it to market. They burn natural gas as their fuel source, and they're not particularly efficient at it. So there's a lot of methane coming out unburned in their exhaust streams. And then finally, you can't do maintenance on a pipeline without getting the methane out of it. And the industry calls this a blowdown. You blow the methane out to the atmosphere. And it doesn't happen every day, but it happens routinely when you do maintenance, and it's a big deal. So just a brief, going back to our blue hydrogen paper, the sensitivity analyses, we looked at different rates of methane emissions. This is a percent of the natural gas that's produced that's emitted unburned to the atmosphere. We used different assumptions on that global warming potential. And so our baseline analysis, the figure I just showed you, is this. And the worst case out of our sensitivity analysis would be to use a higher methane emission number and a somewhat higher global warming potential, and everything goes up. Natural gas emissions go up, the hydrogen, both blue and gray, go up, but it's the same story. Blue hydrogen's not that much better than gray hydrogen, and it's significantly worse than just plain natural gas. The best case scenario is a low, what I think an unreasonably low methane emission estimate, 1.54%. and using a 100-year time period for that global warming potential. And as a result, all of the emissions go down, but it's still the same story. It's hardly a zero footprint for blue hydrogen. It's still worse than the gray hydrogen, and it's not significantly better than natural gas, might be slightly worse than. Now, when our paper came out, we got attacked immediately from industry sources. Social media was all over us, a lot of critical things in the press. And we kept hearing that there's going to be a formal rebuttal in the peer-reviewed literature. That eventually came out. It took them a while. And this is the comment which came out on our paper, came out in finally July of 2022. It was published originally in March of 2022, but they had to withdraw it because they misled the journal about their conflicts of interest. They said they had none. Turns out they had some. These are some of the authors, and they had tight ties to the oil and gas industry. Most of them had no real experience working in this methane world before, and they made some strange things on it. We wrote a rebuttal, and I won't go into any detail on that, but it was a strong rebuttal. We basically said their criticisms were nonsense. And I do want to spend just a little bit of time on one aspect of that, just to give you a sense of what this methane business is like politically in terms of the information. So one of the two, I won't go into the other criticism at all, but one of the two major criticisms of this comment of our paper is that our methane emission estimates were too high. And again, we used a value of 3.5% of production, and we said it might be as low as 1.54 or as high as 4.35. So that's the range of numbers we used in our assumption. These authors strongly said that our numbers were way too high, and they used three different numbers. I'll show you two here first. First, they used that number, which is from a non-peer-reviewed source, pretty old. It's from 2015. 99% of the measurements on methane emissions have been made since that came out. It's not a terrible estimate, but it's a low ball, and it's really old. Then they also used this estimate here from the International Energy Agency from 2018, which is also low. But I'd point out that both of these are within the range of our sensitivity analysis. But further, the International Energy Agency between 2018 and 2022 said, whoops, in light of all the new information on methane emissions, we used to think it was too low. It's now higher. And so they had a revised estimate. This came out before the comment on us, and the commenters used the old number, not the new one. And of course, that's getting up real midstream of where we are. Their third source of information is down here, and it's really the only estimate for methane that's lower than our sensitivity analysis. And that came from an industry website, literally no citations, no data behind it. This is it. It's a single page thing, and it just says that methane emissions have been getting lower and lower over time, and they're now near zero. So they used that to say that we were wrong, which is just amazing. Anyway, that's the state of the art. Just a little bit more on hydrogen, because hydrogen's become so topical at time. And, over most of the last 100 years or so, hydrogen's really not been used much as an energy source or a fuel source. It's used mostly as a chemical feedstock. It's used to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. It's used in oil refineries, et cetera. And people have been talking in the energy world about using hydrogen in the future for hard to decarbonize things, steel manufacturing, et cetera. Talking about green hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from renewable electricity and electrolysis of water to hydrogen and oxygen, so no carbon dioxide. But since 2017, again, the industry has been wildly promoting hydrogen in general, blue hydrogen, for things like used to heat homes. That's how we were being told about it in the Climate Action Council. And I just want to add that since our paper came out in 2021, industry pushed back on it, but they also stopped talking about blue hydrogen, and they came up with this clean energy, clean hydrogen lexicon where they combine green and blue hydrogen. They continue to do that and confuse. And I don't think I'll go into any detail on this. It's just that there's thousands of reasons why you don't want to put any hydrogen into a gas pipeline system and use it for heating ever. And I'll just skip over that. And I'll move on to LNG, which is where I've been spending more of my time over the last year and a half. So for those of you who don't think about LNG, the United States banned the export of liquefied natural gas. And again, liquefied natural gas is just, it's shale gas. You supercool it to liquid form, and then you can move it by insulated tanker. We banned that export from the lower 48 states until 2016. And the law was changed in 2016. If you look at the history here, we're going back to 1950 and up to 2022, I believe. Looking at a couple of different numbers, this is the domestic, this one here is the domestic production of natural gas, including shale gas. This is a production just of shale gas, and it didn't start until 2006 or 7. It's taken off so that today about 84% of the production of natural gas in the United States is shale gas. And then we look at consumption, and consumption bounced around a little bit, but consumption started going up with the shale gas revolution as well. A large part of this increase in shale gas consumption, I will say, is in the state of New York. Even though we banned fracking, our rate of growth of gas has been huge. But this is the average for the U.S., a total for the U.S. as a whole. When you look at the net import or export of gas, we were basically self-sufficient until about 1985 or so. The U.S. became a net importer of gas up until the time that the shale gas boom exceeded our consumption. And so about here is where industry started to lobby for a release of the export ban. And since 2016, we've been a net exporter, and it's driven totally by the increase in shale gas production. And just to give you a sense of what's going on globally with it, the United States grew from not exporting any gas at all in 2015. We're now the world's largest exporter. We're also the world's largest producer of natural gas. And in terms of LNG exports, this shows for several different countries from 2018 to 2022, and then for the first half of 2023, what the change in LNG exports is. So huge increase in the US, modest change in Australia, nothing in Qatar. All the other countries are much, much smaller. So the global change in LNG is a US story since then. Oops, wrong way. So again, LNG is made almost entirely from fracked shale gas. Most of the global increase in natural gas production over the last 15 years has been shale gas production in the US. I believe that's responsible for about a third of the global increase in methane emissions, and methane is an important contributor to global warming. So I submitted a paper looking at the greenhouse gas footprint of LNG about 11 months ago, a little less than 11 months ago. It's finally been accepted for publication earlier this month, and I think it's in its final form now. We're going through page proofs. I think it'll actually be published next week, perhaps the week after. Depends on how much time I can put this weekend into doing with the page proofs, basically. A little bit of history on this. Generally, when I submit a paper to a peer-reviewed journal, I do not share it publicly. There's nothing unethical with doing so, and in fact, some professional societies like the American Society of Physicists encourage their members to do so, but I'm not a physicist, I'm not a member of that, and generally I don't. Nonetheless, I did make this publicly available. We posted it to a Cornell website. And the reason I did so is that Bill McKibben talked me into it. And basically, Bill started communicating with me about a year ago, saying, this LNG export's a huge deal. No one's paying enough attention to it. The climate impacts must be huge. And do you know anyone who's working on that? And I said, well, yeah, I am, and I've got a paper coming along. And he said, well, you got to share it publicly. And I said, well, I don't generally do that, Bill. He talked me into it, the bottom line. He guilt tripped me. He said, you have a choice here, Howarth. Turns out under the law, the president and secretary of energy as of last December had to either say that more natural gas export of LNG would be in the national interest of the United States, in which case industry could continue to export more and more, or conversely, they could say, no, it's not in the national interest of the United States. The law back in 2015 that allowed the export set a quota, and we met the quota last December. So again, the only way to go above that quota was by presidential order. So Bill said to me last October, he goes, your paper could have a real impact on that if it's shared now. And if you wait till next summer when it's published through the peer review system, you'll have your 231st peer review paper, and you'll be really proud of that. And 3 other people in the world will read it and no one will care. So you got to make it public. So I did. I publicly posted it. He used it. He wrote about it in the New Yorker, and he wrote about it in the Nation last November. And the White House did pay attention. They postponed making a decision in December, but they made a decision in January. Biden himself did a press conference on it, and he actually said that it probably was not in the national interest to have more LNG export for a variety of reasons, but that including the climate aspect, he said methane from it was a big issue, and that recent research from Cornell University had convinced them to take a closer look. So I put a pause on and ordered the Department of Energy to take a look at my analysis and think about that, which they're still doing. So again, they have a pause as of last January. My paper, which still was not published at the time, it's only been accepted earlier this month, was clearly part of the reason for that. So let me get a little bit into the science here and then back to the politics in a minute. Fracking is energy intensive in addition to having methane emissions associated with it. And so there are carbon dioxide emissions associated with the fracking operations, the drilling operations, the pipeline emissions, in addition to the final CO2 from burning the fuel. And for liquefied natural gas, it takes, in addition to that, you already have an energy intensive source of.
I'm not John. This is a
gas.
number. Please get my number removed from your list.
Okay. For LNG, it takes considerable energy to supercool and liquefy the gas. It also surprisingly takes energy to heat it up and regasify it at source. The energy for that comes from burning shale gas and LNG. It also, most tankers are powered by the LNG that they're carrying. It takes some of that and liquefy it, regasify it and use it. So there's a substantial amount of shale gas and LNG that's involved in making and transporting the LNG. And that means that it takes a lot more shale gas to deliver a unit of gas to market than simply what's delivered in the end. And that means that all those upstream emissions of methane, as well as the indirect carbon dioxide emissions, are multiplied and higher than simply for shale gas. Also, I looked in great detail at the type of tankers that are used, and the older tankers most tankers are pretty new, actually. Half the tankers carrying LNG in the world are less than 6 years old now, and almost all of them are less than 15 or 20 years old, so they're fairly new. But the oldest of them are steam powered and relatively fuel inefficient. The most modern ones are more fuel efficient, but surprisingly, they emit more methane because they are less efficient at actually burning the fuel, even though their overall energy efficiency is higher. So I looked at that as part of my paper as well. Now, for methane emissions, this LNG story is a methane story still, just like blue hydrogen. And when I submitted the paper originally last October, I was using the same methane emissions I was telling you about earlier that we used for the blue hydrogen paper. During the course of the past year, a new synthesis on methane emissions from shale gas in the United States came out. It was published in Nature last March. And I rewrote the paper to use this. The numbers I was using before were based on about 20 peer-reviewed studies in the neighborhood of about 10,000 actual observations of emissions. This new synthesis has close to 1 million observations on methane emissions from shale gas development in the United States now. So clearly they're a better source, and I rewrote my paper to use it. And the number I pulled out of that is 2.8%. I won't go into a lot of detail why. It's a little bit less than we were saying for blue hydrogen. It's a little bit higher than what the International Energy Agency still says, but it's within the range of what we've been thinking for quite some time. I think it's fairly conservative, but I wanted to be conservative again. I will say that where the shale gas is coming from for LNG exports matters. And so the number I'm using there represents the Permian Basin of Texas and New Mexico. and also the gas fields of Louisiana. And in fact, the LNG export has been coming largely from Louisiana and Texas, and is projected to continue to do so if the White House allows that expanded capacity, and that's what the industry would like to do. So I think the number I'm using is well represented for this. I've already been attacked by industry, and they said, well, I really should have used the number for Pennsylvania, which they think is lower. But Pennsylvania is not a big LNG exporter and is not expected to be so. Okay, so this is one of two slides that I'm going to show you from the paper. And we're looking here at the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, total greenhouse gas emissions per mass of LNG delivered to market per kilogram. And the blue here is the carbon dioxide from the final burning of the fuel. The yellow is other carbon dioxide emissions, such as from the tankers, but also from the fracking operations, et cetera. And red is methane. We're looking at 4 different types of tankers. And for each type, we're looking at the shortest cruises, which would be from Louisiana coast to the United Kingdom, and the longest ones, which would be from Texas coast to Shanghai, and in between is the average length of a LNG tanker at the moment. So from this, you see that the final carbon dioxide emissions are non-trivial, but they're less than these other emissions. And in fact, the methane emissions are more important across the board. Longer cruises emit more across the board. None of the tankers are particularly good. These are the most common tankers, the steam-powered ones. They're being replaced by these 2-stroke and 4-stroke engines. And if you have a good eye, these indirect carbon dioxide emissions are a little bit less from that, but the methane emissions are higher. And that's because, again, they don't burn the fuel as cleanly. I think I just said that. And in here, I'm comparing LNG in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per energy unit delivered to market for the shortest and longest cruises. And we're comparing with natural gas as it would be used domestically, coal, diesel oil, or with heat pumps. In case of heat pumps, it would be a heat pump driven by the electricity of the average grid emissions for Europe. So clearly heat pumps are much better than any fossil fuel, but also LNG is worse than any fossil fuel, far worse than any fossil fuel. So it's hardly a climate solution, which industry is still trying to sell. Now, this is done for the 20-year time period. If we do the analysis for the 100-year time period, which I think severely understates the damage from methane, this is what we get. LNG for the longer cruises is still worse than any fossil fuel. For the shortest cruises, it's still going to be worse than natural gas, far worse than heat pumps. It's about the same as coal. So LNG is never, under any of these assumptions, a good fuel. I think I've said all that. I started to get a lot of pushback on this right after Biden made his announcement in January. The Wall Street Journal called me up and said they were doing an investigative report on my motivations and all, and they talked to hundreds of people, literally, and me for hours at a time, and produced this article back in March where they say I'm the climate scientist most hated by the fossil fuel industry. It's an interesting read if you want to take a look. More recently, the Breakthrough Institute, which is an interesting organization with tight ties to the oil and gas and nuclear industry, wrote a report criticizing one of the earlier drafts of my paper. And the House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology picked up on that, had a series of hearings on it where they had the BTA, the Breakthrough Institute people testify, but they didn't ask me to comment or testify. And they decided they formally censored me for using flawed methodology and lacking scientific rigor. So I was asked how I was going to push back on that, and I didn't push back, but others did. And there's a sign-on letter that came out in July in support of my paper. It was addressed to Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of Treasury, and it addresses the House criticism. These are the initial signers. Sandra Steingraber, our local friend, did a lot of the drafting of it, and she did a great job. It's about a 5-page letter saying, really, my science is very reasonable. it's not flawed methodology. I'm pretty mainstream. I'm pretty conservative. Any rational scientist would think so. Overall, over 130 scientists signed it, and I'm particularly pleased that Michael Mann is one of the prime signers. Michael, if you don't know him, is, to my mind, probably the most important climate scientist in the world right now. And he's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, highly respected. The other thing is that I was able to, 2 days ago, actually, go to Washington and in a private meeting with a bunch of U.S. senators and congressmen address and talk about this. And I got a very favorable reception there. So again, this is from 2 days ago. Senators and congressmen were coming and going all of the time because that was the day that the House of Representatives was finally passing the budget resolution, and they and senators were coming in and out. But basically, for 2 hours, we sat at a table here. That's Senator Ed Markey, who was chairing the thing. He stayed for the total 2 hours while others didn't. And at the end, he, together with Congressman Tonko from New York and Congressman Sarbanes from Maryland, stayed to do a photo op with us. Well, anyway, that's my quick update. I'm pretty happy with where things stand at the moment on LNG. And again, the paper will be coming out within a week or two. Final version's available now, and I'm quite happy with the conclusions from it.
Bob,
And I always love the opportunity to talk to you guys.
thanks, Bob. That was really informative. The Wall Street article, I think, is behind a paywall. Is there any way you could share that with us so that we could read the whole thing instead of the first paragraph or two?
I think I have a full version of it, but if you would send me an email and I'll look for it tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll follow up.
It'll take me an hour to find it, and I don't have an hour today. But yes,
Well,
good point.
It would be really interesting to see the whole thing.
It's an interesting article. It's not a hatchet job. They spent a lot of time talking to me about my motivation, and they basically had a hard time believing that I'm as naive and straightforward as I am, and I'm just doing this because I believe it. But they basically portray me as a very, very solid scientist who is probably politically naive, but doing a good job of the science and hated by the industry who can't believe that people could be motivated just by wanting to convey information. That's the bottom line of it.
Yeah, and try to
It does
prevent.
make me look naive, but whatever.
Well, I don't think it's naive to try to prevent the world from driving over the cliff.
Well, I don't either, right? I think we have an ethical obligation to do so. That's what I said. But
yeah. The interesting thing about the Wall Street Journal is that its reporting actually is, at least my impression, more balanced than their editorial page, which is really off its rocker.
And I talked to the reporter a lot, and I at one point said, and this is true, people had suggested I not talk to him because they could do a hatchet job on me. And I said, I'm talking to you anyway, but I am a little worried. And he goes, we're not controlled by the same folks, and that's true. But, there were a lot of people who would not talk to him because they were worried about how it would come across. So it's
yeah, must have been a really interesting experience, though, being under the spotlight.
It's been an interesting 6 to 9 months, I gotta say. And the other thing I should say, I'm glad Bill McKibben talked me into making it available because I think it made a difference. But in addition to adding stress generally to my life, it slowed down the publication of the paper a lot because the journal editors were clearly aware of the political importance and political standing of the paper, and they wanted to make sure that it would stand up, right? So normally for a peer-reviewed process like this, you'd go through 1 or 2 rounds of revision. I went through 5 rounds of revision, and they kept adding in new anonymous peer reviewers. So by the time I was done, I had about 16 anonymous peer reviewers.
Wow.
You got to respond to all of them, and that it's a better paper for it. The conclusions pretty much the same, but the presentation and logic is clearer.
Yeah.
And so the peer review worked as it should, but it took an incredible amount of time, and responding to peer reviews is tedious process at best. It's not fun.
Yeah, I think it's a lot less intense in history. I mean, I've had several papers published that were peer reviewed and maybe 3 or 4 readers at most.
This is the most I've ever
16 is off
had.
the charts.
Yeah, you know, the reviews there were never any terribly negative reviews, but they'd say things like, well, it'd be better if you add this extra table to do this, or, you know, it'd be better if you wrote your equations this way instead of that way, or, you know, a lot of the papers about tanker stuff, and they got reviewers who are clearly experts in how tanker engines work, which I'm not. And those reviewers would come back and go, well, it's a really interesting paper, but Howarth clearly doesn't understand how 4-stroke engines work in modern tankers, and he should look at these 5 papers on it. You sit there and go, they're incredible reads, right? But I worked some of that in. But then at the end, they'd go, but we don't understand the upstage methane thing, so you should get other peer reviewers. And it kept going through that sort of iteration.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when the process works.
It worked, and the journal did a good job. It was I did not enjoy it, and you can talk to Roxanne, who I think is on the call, and she'll tell you that she didn't enjoy it either. But
Yeah, it's pretty,
but it
pretty
worked.
brutal. I mean, just with 3 or 4
Yeah,
peer review readers.
no, I've
in
never
my
seen anything
experience,
like
but
it.
they have 16 and 5 different drafts. I
And you
mean,
never
that's-
really know if they're going to accept it or not, although you assume so because it was nothing all that negative. But in the meanwhile, I'm getting all these calls continuously from reporters from The Guardian, from the New York Times, and from congressional staffers. When's your paper going to be published? And they're damned if I know.
Yeah, I saw the article on blue hydrogen in The Guardian. You were interviewed for that, and it was, I thought, very impactful.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay, so we got lots of hands out there. Let's start with Martha Robertson.
Hey, Bob, thank you. This is really, really fascinating. A couple
you.
questions. One is maybe rhetorical and you can't answer. Why the hell does the Senate have closed door meetings and hearings, and the House has, you know, public hearings where they pillory people? I don't know
Well,
if you have
that's a great question. The Senate could have had an open hearing on it. The group that threw this hearing together is called the Senate Climate Task Force, and it's co-chaired by Markey and Senator Whitehouse. And they decided that it would be best to handle this through their task force as opposed to one of the committees. And the task force is composed completely of Democrats, and they invited like-minded Democrats from the House of Representatives to participate as well. So what that does is allow, you know, we had they asked us each to give a 5-minute talk, and they invited in other experts too from around the world on LNG, mostly in economics and all. They asked us each to give a 5-minute presentation, and then we had another hour and a half of conversation under Chatham House rules, so that the senators and congressmen could say what they really wanted to say and hear what our responses would be. So they're formulating how to make a stronger pushback on LNG is what they're doing.
Okay, I mean, I understand that, but it also means it's behind closed doors.
Well, that's true, but you know, to me, it was a fun day, you know, and if it was an open hearing, it would have been nasty, right? Because I
Yeah.
would have been attacked by people for my ethics, etc.
So the Department of Energy is reviewing the pause on exports.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of when? I'm gonna take a wild guess. They won't come out with a decision till after the election.
That's a good guess.
Okay. And do you, if they make a decision, how permanent is it? Is it like just until the next president takes office or what?
Yes. Well, there's a whole bunch of things going on. Biden, basically what he did was say he was not going to issue an executive order. That's what he said in January. It would take a presidential executive order to allow further LNG exports. A federal district court in Louisiana ruled that he couldn't do that. And so there's some legal limbo it's in right now. And the Department of Energy has appealed that. It's under appeal at the moment, but nothing is going to happen until after the election. The House of Representatives has passed a resolution saying that the administration has to do it. And there are two things under review by the Department of Energy. One is the stuff I was just talking about, greenhouse gas consequences. The other is the economic impact to U.S. consumers. And that's what most of the other people were talking about 2 days ago in this Senate group. And, you know, the take-home message there, one of the experts from IEFA said that since the LNG ban was lifted in 2015, it has cost U.S. consumers $100 billion in increased energy prices, both natural gas and electric prices. Electric prices have gone up nationally in part because of the higher cost of natural gas. There's more volatility in that, and that's driven by the LNG. So the Department of Energy has to be looking at both those things. My guess is that in the end, they'll come back and say, they don't like my analysis. You really got to use a 100-year time period, and they're going to stick with the official EPA methane emission estimates, which are not based on these million observations that are reported in the peer-reviewed literature. Instead, it's industry self-reporting that's unverified, but that's what they have a history of doing. They're going to fall back and say that. But I don't really see how they're going to refute the economic things. And of course, you know, if Harris is president, then we'll see how that plays out. If Trump is president, then he has the power. He would have the power to issue an executive order and just do it. There's nothing to reverse because, again, it wasn't that Biden made an order. It's that he said he would not.
Interesting to sue to force him to do that.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, just not to take more time, but I wonder how the Ukrainian war and European need for energy has changed the
That's the other thing that we discussed in some detail on Wednesday. And, you know, this is the LNG, you know, exports was sold before the war in Ukraine, and it was mostly done in terms of how it would help get gas to China and therefore decrease coal use in China. That's how it was sold originally. Well, it's not doing that, really. Coal consumption in China is constant. Gas is being replaced in China by renewables, which is about half the cost for new electric generation in China compared to LNG. So it's not doing that at all. The Ukraine war provided another excuse, so we have to get the LNG to Europe. And in fact, there is some evidence that for a year it helped Europe get through that first bad winter. But the Europeans have responded by installing heat pumps at a rate you've never seen before and doing other things. And so their use of natural gas is now 25% less than it was 3 years ago. And they're projected to cut that by another 25% within the next 3 to 4 years. So they don't need our LNG either. So then the question came up, well, where is this LNG going? And the answer is it's being held largely by big traders, and they're trying to develop new markets for it, largely in Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and India, which historically have used less than 1% of their energy mixes from natural gas. The goal is to try and make them dependent on U.S. LNG. I think that'll fail, in which case this whole thing will fail of its own, you know, economic collapse. But the Europeans don't need and are not buying the gas and are not going to be taking it, and the Chinese don't want it either for economic reasons. And the other buyers are Japan and Korea, and there's a expert from Korea who is part of the group we were talking with, and he said that South Korea has cut their use of natural gas by 20% over the last 5 years and hopes to cut it again by 50% by 2035.
Oh, it's a shame you don't know anything about economics either, Bob. Thank you very, very much. This is great. Thank you.
This is what I learned 2 days ago. It's a great panel, actually. They had this fellow from Germany who spoke to the European need. This fellow from Korea spoke to the Asian needs. IEFA guy is the economist, and they had a woman who's a Native American from South Texas who was talking about what a god-awful mess these LNG facilities make on the South Texas coast. Very powerful.
All right, thanks, Bob.
Lisa, you're next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bob. What a great presentation. I speaking of the costs for US consumers, a lot of us who've been fighting the gas utilities in New York over building LNG terminals with this sort of claim that it's to serve New York's own ratepayers. So using ratepayer money to build infrastructure, pipelines, and LNG terminals, for these past decades, that including like the compressor station in my town, to move more gas from the Pennsylvania, which seems to be really a scam on the ratepayers in order to put in place ways to export gas in the future. And I've raised this so many times with government agencies in New York, and no one has ever looked into whether we're just being scammed, but it just seems so obvious that we are. And I'm wondering if there's anybody looking into that, and whether that situation also exists in, Louisiana and the Permian Basin and Texas, or is that just a New York based phenomenon, or if you know.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lisa. And I don't know who's looking at it in the New York context, other than you and the people you know. But my take is I hear similar things anywhere you look in the country. So it's not just a New York phenomenon. This is the way the industry operates, right? There's still, again, the U.S. is now the world's largest producer and exporter of gas, and they just want to keep that going, and they're investing like hell in it. It's hard for me to see how it's economically sustainable for any real period of time, but they're making a lot of money off of it in the meanwhile. I don't know. It's discouraging, but I do think it will implode of its own weight in due time, because the raw economics are just not there.
Exactly. Well, we've been saying this for how long? And
Too long, I know. Well, and on the LNG thing specifically, I got to tell you, people started telling me even before I started working on the blue hydrogen paper, which would have been 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years. People said, well, you really should be paying more attention to LNG and focusing on that. And I said, yeah, right. And I didn't want to. I didn't want to look. But I had no sense of how big a change it was, And once I started looking, I go, oh my God, they're right. I should have been paying attention to
so
this.
glad you did. And
it happened so quickly, it's a
Yeah.
major change in the world. I had no idea.
Well, I know what a pain that extensive review process is, but in the end, isn't it better for all of us that it's completely bomb-proof, right? Like, it's just
Oh, no,
great.
it's a far better paper. It's
Hang our hat on it. So thank you, and
thank you.
Roxanne, for tolerating all of that.
Well, Roxanne not only tolerated it, but she and our daughter, Marina Howarth, helped me a lot too. The first draft of the paper I put out, I described all of the math, all of the calculations, but I did it verbally in text. And the reviewers came back and said, you really have to put this in either an Excel file, which I resisted doing, or an equation form so one could follow it. And that was a lot of work. I did that last Christmas, basically. My daughter was visiting, and it was really tough getting all of the units right and correct. And it's, basically what I'd written the first time was correct, but I discovered how difficult it was even for me to explain it. So it's now clear as the bottom line, but both Roxanne and Marina helped me a lot with those unit mass balance issues, which
right. And so Peter, I know thank you for sending out. So I asked Bob to present at our upcoming teach-in on Tuesday at noon on false climate solutions, and unfortunately Bob wasn't available, but we do have 3 great presenters who are presenting on hydrogen blending, renewable natural gas, and carbon capture and storage. So Peter's going to send that back out, but I wish we had Bob on that teach-in as well. But I think it's going to be, it'll really be a good coming after this to look at how these are being sort of how it's affecting New York's climate progress, that these false solutions are trying to be injected into our energy plan. So
that's important. Wish I could help them, but I can't.
Thanks. Well, we'll have more, Bob.
Only so many hours in the week, right?
Yes. All right. I'm going to mute myself now before I.
Peter's looking like he wants to move on to his next discussion soon.
No. This is getting us there.
Okay.
So I just wanted to remind people that even if you're not available at noon on on that day for the Zoom webinar, you should go ahead and register anyways, because then you'll get a follow-up email that will provide you with a link to the recording. So definitely go back and take a look at the emails I've been sending out for this meeting, but I will, as Lisa indicated, also follow up when I send the link out to this recording later. I'll include the information about that as well. Bethany.
Good morning. Thank you, Bob and Peter and everyone. Bob, I'm struck by the public pushback that you've received from fossil fuel industry and politicians about your science. And I am curious about some of the asymmetry. So you probably know that The Guardian just covered a fossil-free Cornell report on fossil fuel funding for researchers at Cornell.
Right.
And the question came up when I was talking to them, I wonder how Bob feels about his colleagues who get funding from fossil fuels, because you have put yourself on the line and your work has been under incredible scrutiny because you are speaking publicly about the policy implications of your climate science. On the other hand, a lot of your colleagues are quietly receiving money from fossil fuels, and consciously or unconsciously, the research suggests it introduces a bias. And could you speak to that? And what do you think the appropriate response is for researchers who are participating in this kind of systemic bias through funding?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bethany. Funding, it can bias research. There's no doubt about that, right? And if the funding is coming from the oil and gas industry, at the very least, we should have full disclosure so people know who's getting funding to do this. I don't think we do a good enough job of that at any university. Cornell, I don't think is the worst. If you look at some of the other institutions covered in the Guardian article, or some of the other institutions which are out there, I think MIT, which is where I got my PhD, so I hate to say it, but I think they're probably among the worst. There's some real bias stuff going on at Columbia, also at Stanford, some really good stuff out of Stanford, but there's some industry funded stuff that's really terrible. I think we're kind of at Cornell in the median level, where there's not the sort of overt industry support that you see coming out of MIT, Columbia, or Stanford. But the funding source does bias the topics one takes on, if nothing else, and therefore where it leads in terms of policy implications. So I think it's something that all of us in the community, broadly, the academic community, but also in the Cornell community, need to be talking about a great deal more. And I hope we can move to greater transparency. I mean, there's Michael Mann at University of Pennsylvania has argued that universities should simply prohibit funding from the oil and gas industry. I probably lean a little bit that way, but at the very least, we should make sure that we don't have institutes which are simply mouthpieces for industry. And at Cornell, we don't in this area, I don't think. But that we don't have that hidden bias in our research as well, which we do.
Thank you.
Let's see. Dave Bradley.
I think this paper is great because it publishes just, or it makes it apparent how important LNG is to the present oil and gas arrangement. But to summarize it, LNG exports set the domestic price of methane. And right now there's an excess of methane. So without LNG, the price that methane would be offered would be less than zero, which would bankrupt a lot of people. And eventually, that would work itself out, such as the US would be exporting methanol and ammonia and stuff like that. But for the time being, it's LNG rate exports set the price of methane. And that's important to understand if you want to quash this industry, is just quash LNG exports, because right now fracking for oil produces such a vast excess of methane and more than people can deal with. And you can actually crush the industry by stopping LNG exports and bankrupting all these firms. So
Yeah.
there's the
Yeah.
political aspect of it.
Yeah.
Is we have the ability to stop this crazy exporting. And in the process, you'd actually bankrupt a big part of the petrochemical and especially the methane production and marketing in the US. So,
Yeah. Exactly right. And, you know, going back to Martha's question, it wouldn't have been nice to do this in public meeting instead. You know, the advantage of doing it in a closed door meeting was that, you know, we were having those sort of discussions with these senators and powerful congressmen, and they are looking for that political messaging to move this on and get rid of it. And they were, you know, they would throw things out to us saying things like that. And did you think this is a good way to frame it? No, you can't do that in an open hearing. And in order to be able to sit down with, you know, actual senators who are actually paying attention to it and have them try to get that political messaging right, it's just such an experience. It was amazing.
A lot
They
less
get it.
posturing goes on behind closed doors, that's for sure.
Yeah. If you're going to have closed door meetings, I think this is a good one.
Well, it must have been really terrific to spend that kind of time with Senator Markey.
It was, you know, we had a reception that night too, and people debated whether the NRDC organized it, and people debated whether Markey would actually show up or not. But they, you know, about 30 of us all together, and Markey did show up with his senior staff, and they stayed for another 2 hours that night to talk more over wine about all of this. So he's into it. The other I just have to say, you know, one of the other participants in the thing was Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who I'm a big fan of generally. And he had to go because he had to go and vote, but he apologized and said he had to go. And then on his way out, he put his hand on my shoulder and whispered in my ear, and he said, you may not know this, but my wife is a PhD level marine scientist, and she's a huge fan of you as a scientist. And she's been telling me about your work for decades. And he goes, and actually, you don't remember this either, but I think 25 years ago, you gave a lecture on nitrogen pollution at URI, and I was in the audience. So I've been following you ever since. So that's kind of cool to have a senator tell you.
Yeah, and White House is really something as well. I mean, he appears pretty regularly on MSNBC, and
Yeah.
he always has a terrific perspective on what's happening in Washington,
Right.
especially when it comes to the ethics of the U.S. Supreme Court, but also on climate change as well, and the fossil fuel industry. Irene.
Yeah, so Bob, amazing, just amazing, and thank you for continuing to be so far out in front, leading this and pushing for what we know is right. I just want to both encourage people to attend the False Solutions thing that Lisa talked about next week, and also give my prediction of what happens with the methane that gets produced here, especially, you know, if we cut back exports or whatever, is something that you mentioned early in your talk, is blue hydrogen, which will use the methane. And then the way that blue hydrogen works is to capture the CO2. There will be some discussion of that in the False Solutions thing, but the oil and gas industry, the utilities are starting to push really hard for hydrogen as the next solution. And the Biden administration has put in place enormous tax credits and subsidies for carbon capture, both through their Inflation Reduction Act and through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And so I think that we really need to watch on that front. Because all of this carbon capture and so-called sequestering it in the ground is bullshit. A lot of what they're doing with the carbon or the CO2 that they inject into the ground right now is using it to bring up more oil, and with that comes more gas. And so anyhow, do attend the webinar next week that Lisa posted, but I just think that's the next front that we're going to have to really watch for and push back on, is using the fracked gas to make blue hydrogen, and for the companies to then collect the subsidies for reusing the CO2 to keep their industry going.
I agree.
Yeah, and it's just crazy. I mean, the talk about expanding the pipeline infrastructure to transport the quote unquote captured CO2 to store in underground caverns and that sort of thing. It just seems like this is like kind of a endless kind of feedback loop, but at some point it's
I
got
think
to
it's going to
stop.
run its time too. I know industry's pushing it like hell. They are elsewhere too. This fellow who's here from South Korea on Wednesday said that South Korea is finally pulling back on it, that they've started to realize that blue hydrogen is just not a good idea. The other thing I should mention, I'm part of a group together with Mark Jacobson from Stanford and Charlie Harvey from MIT and others, that a group of academics that are trying to provide an objective pushback on carbon capture generally. And one of the things I learned from Charlie Harvey, which I didn't know, is that when you put the CO2 underground, ideally you want to put it in something that's geologically capped, but there are a limited number of places you can do that, assuming you can even get it to the site through the pipeline and all. If it's not a perfect cap, Charlie points out, and they've observed this places, then the carbon dioxide starts to migrate towards the surface. And of course, as it migrates to the surface, the pressure on it decreases. And since it's a gas, it expands, and it expands explosively and can just blow out of the ground. So, I think as people start to realize things like that, and that there really are very, very few places where it's even safe to do this, despite all of the other idiocy, I think it will die its death. Might take a decade, but
Sounds like some of those blowouts in Siberia that are so
yeah, which are the
terrifying.
same sort of things, right? You start migrating gas and you get us exponential increase in volume.
Fun times. Martha,
Yeah, maybe this slides to the next topic, but Bob, what about the climate action, the state's climate action plan, CLCPA implementation, and what you and others on the council might be doing to, I hope, to try to encourage actual implementation of the law? Is that something we have time, Peter, to talk about?
absolutely. It's right on point.
Great, thanks.
Let me, thank you for that. The Climate Action Council has not met since December of 2022, when we passed the final scoping plan. And, the co-chairs were Basil Sagos, who resigned as commissioner of DEC, and there's only an acting commissioner, and people say that probably means he's not a member of the Climate Action Council. And Doreen Harris, who's the president of NYSERDA, is the other co-chair. The governor's office clearly does not want the council engaged in their planning on this. And I ran into Doreen Harris in Syracuse a couple of weeks ago when the governor had her energy summit up there. And, I specifically suggested to her that maybe it'd be nice to get the council together, and it might be helpful to them actually, not just a impediment. And she sort of laughed. But I don't think we're going to meet anytime soon. And that's clearly coming from the governor. Under the law, the CLCPA, the Climate Action Council had to produce the scoping plan, the blueprint. But we don't have anything else we have to do. And so they don't have to have us meet. On the other hand, the scoping plan has to be updated by law every 5 years, and it has to be a 2-year process because we have to have a draft plan, which you then take a year to revise. So within the next year and a half, they have to have us meet again. And that'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, because they're shutting us out of it at the moment.
Sure, but you guys have each other's emails, right? I just
Yeah, Yeah,
if
but
there could be an informal,
well, look, there are 22 people on the council, but Basil Sagos was one. He's not there anymore, so that's down to 21. And Peter Wanowitz was one, and he resigned, and he's not been replaced by the assembly. So there are 20 of us, and of the 20, 11 work somehow or report somehow or another to the governor, and 2 work for the fossil fuel industry. And so you start adding up the rest of us who might actually be doing something. It's a relatively small number. And yes, we do talk some and try to think about what we could do, but we haven't figured out how we can really be effective yet.
oh, I hear you. I was gonna say, well, maybe we could get the assembly to appoint somebody else, but it seems like the assembly is kind of maybe our biggest problem.
I at the moment would just as soon have the assembly not appoint someone until they get their act together, right?
Yeah.
And there's some
Okay.
ambiguity. I mean, I think I'm still a member. There's no term date on my appointment, but I suppose if the Speaker of the Assembly wanted to replace me, I suppose he has that power. So I'm not sure I really want to draw attention to that at the moment either.
Yeah,
Right.
and that really does move us into the and thanks to Martha for pushing us in this direction. But the Speaker of the House is really one of the major obstacles here. Clearly,
Speaker of
is
the Assembly, yeah.
yeah. I'm sorry, yeah.
No, he clearly is, and I've never met him. He appointed me, and he appointed Peter Winowitz, and he appointed Paul Shepson, who's the atmospheric methane expert at Stony Brook. But that's because at the time, Steve Engelbright, the assembly person from Stony Brook, pushed us to, and it's Engelbright's bill, right? But Engelbright was not reelected, and that left, I think, sort of a vacuum in terms of who is providing Hasty with information. And if people can figure out how to, people say I should talk to Hasty, well, that's not going to work. But if people can figure out how to reach Hasty, I think that is required to moving the state ahead.
Peter, Lisa has a direct response to this discussion. I think she's been involved with what's going on at the Capitol.
Yeah, why don't you weigh in, Lisa?
Well, just very quickly, thanks. So the state has kicked off their required energy planning process. And unlike the scoping plan, the state energy plan is binding. Doreen Harris heads that up. Roy Christian is on it. The assembly appointed Edie Barrett as their rep on it, which is not good for us. But this is a process that we need to engage in now for the state to move forward. That process is supposed to happen every 4 years. It didn't when the scoping plan was coming out. It sort of happened. They sort of said, well, we've got the scoping plan. So there's going to be hearings all over the state next summer on this, and opportunities for comment and organizing around the state energy plan. And I think we're going to have to really pay attention to that process that just kicked off at the beginning of this month.
If I could
Thanks,
just
please.
briefly chime in, I agree, Lisa, it's really critical. And I also agree it's not great that Edie Barrett's the assembly person on it. But just a gentle correction, the scoping plan is binding in many ways on agencies, and the Public Service Commission certainly considers it. So Rory Christian certainly thinks it is binding on them.
Right. Well, then, but they are also not moving forward the pieces that we need to do to enact it, like, the changes to utility law that are in New York Heat Act. So they're,
Right.
we're.
No, it's I think the PSC, I think, is simply understaffed and under politically supported, and I think they feel like they're moving ahead as quickly as they can in difficult times. I know that. I talk to Rory quite regularly,
Well, and
I tend to agree with that. But I think they could use political help on the outside, people pushing them.
yes,
And
that.
other agencies need to do a hell of a lot more. I mean, the building decarbonization is still to
Well,
me, the
the
most important thing, and no
development.
one's doing anything on it, as far as I know. And that's not a PSC issue. It's other agencies, and they're not doing anything.
Well, the PSC told Hochul that New York wasn't ready for the New York Heat Act, so not to push it ahead. So, but the the DEC was supposed to do sector-specific emissions limits, and they started that process, and someone told them to slow it down, and now they're actually overdue for that, and we are demanding sector-specific in our upcoming building electrification equity platform letter to the governor, a limit, an emissions limit specifically for gas utilities, and I hope you'll all join us in making that demand, because that's where we're going to get our buildings progress, by passing New York Heat and getting that limit, because right now in all the gas planning proceedings and all the rate cases, all the gas utilities say, well, nowhere in this plan it says how much we have to reduce our emissions by. So therefore, everything we put forward is compliant with CLCPA, which we all know is bullshit, but we need that limit. And we know
Hochul did include much of the Heat Act in her budget. It was Hasty who blocked it.
Martha, I'd love to talk to you more, but believe me, if you knew what was going on behind the scenes with Hochul and her staff, you would not be happy about it.
Yeah, I know. Okay, got it.
Could I speak here, Peter?
Yeah, go ahead, Brian. I know you've got
So,
a lot of insight.
I'm a little worried that the state energy planning process will be an end run around the Climate Action Council. The governor's pushing, nuclear now, and the Climate Action Council wasn't particularly sympathetic to that or fossil fuel interests. I mean, she did control like 11 or 12 of the agency heads, but the council was not beholden to Hochul. I think historically the state energy planning process has been a very state agency centric process. It's had hearings and people made comments, but in the end, it pretty much came out the way that they introduced it. So I'm a little concerned that this is going to be taking this whole thing more away from public participation, and unlike the Climate Action Plan and the Climate Action Council, which was very open, had a lot of involvement. I just think we're moving away from that, especially now that we're introducing nuclear, which will not be popular.
So Brian, I wanted to ask you about the report card that the Climate Can't Wait Coalition has prepared. Have you seen that, the draft?
No, I think they're just about ready to release it.
Yeah, I've got a draft
a
sitting on my desktop, and
yeah.
I was hoping they would go public with it so I could share it with this group for this discussion, but
I'll check in with them.
that'd be great if you would. Suffice it to say, it's a brutal report, and justifiably so. And they go through point by point on the ways in which the governor has fallen dramatically short of what needs to be done. I'm looking for some good news here. I may have this wrong, but my sense from what I'm reading is that the New York State building code that was updated is supporting the implementation of the All Electric Buildings Act. Lisa, Brian, is that your impression?
It's not done. It's still a draft.
Yeah.
Well,
So
the comment period ended this week, though, on the draft, and then they'll update it with the comments, and then there will be another comment period for the final draft. So I was assuming that we were moving in the right direction, but I mean, I'm waiting for people, Rewiring America, New York Geo, and others to weigh in with their comments on it, and hopefully, it's been so busy, I wasn't able to really do comments, which are due on the 26th.
Yeah, I've seen a kind of bullet point overview of it, and it struck me as something that would be supporting that piece of legislation, which I do think is good news. And sometimes you have to really scramble to find the good news, but I think that's something that is worth people paying attention to.
Yeah, let me
it
just
rolls
add
out.
this is in the last round of upgrades, there were a lot more public elected officials involved, and it was a very progressive. You know, it had like a 10% reduction in emissions in that, and the developers and the builders got very upset with that. They changed the whole voting pattern. There is 17 members, and there's 6 elected officials, and I had been talking about this for several months to get, and the 3 members are 3 vacancies, all public officials, that the ones are likely to push a more progressive building code. And I was hoping, you know, I had talked about actually getting people appointed to those positions, and there's a few people on this call that may remember that I was pushing hard on that. But then I stepped back when I thought things were going in the right direction. But you know, this is where the votes for a more progressive plan will come from, and we're 3 people short.
Yeah. And then the issues, Brian, that you've raised, just more locally focused on the ways, and correct me if I'm not framing this properly, but the ways in which it looks like Cornell's doing an end run around the energy code supplement. And I know Rebecca's been having to deal with that as well.
Well, we brought it to their attention that you know, that they on October 24th they did a neg deck for a McGraw Hall renovation, which was $110 million project, and the project was you know, included, they were going to comply with the you know, the expanded code. And the next day after that was they issued the neg deck. Cornell wrote them saying, well, we don't really believe that we have to meet this standard. And a week later, the code enforcement guy in the city said, okay, you're right. So, and the Cornell person was the former code enforcement officer for the city, and the person that agreed with him was worked for him. And it was completely decided by these 2 people without any consultation with the drafters of the thing or any other, as far as I know, any other supervisory. Or we're very disappointed. But it came up last night at the planning board meeting. I can send you what I wrote to them, but they were not interested in this. And there are other people on this call that shared the same disappointment with regard to the fossil fuel plastic grass project that they're promoting. We lost on both of those.
Yeah, I think the artificial plastic turf action was especially irresponsible, just not wanting to hear anything about the long-term impact of the microplastics. And
we wrote a 19-page document this week that highlighted each one of the secret provisions that were violated in this review. I mean, I'm not sure many people have a tolerance for this kind of a document. I'd be glad to share it with them, though.
what do you think is going to happen with that document? Is there any way to use it as leverage, or
let me
are the folks
invite
on the planning board in
Yeah.
town and city just
yeah.
beyond?
Let me let Bethany in on this one, or Irene, who joined me in producing this document.
Yeah, I put in the chat when Brian said we lost on both points. Correction, we haven't won yet. The story isn't over
That's
yet. The story isn't over until we're all dead, and so far we're alive. And yeah, we'll reach out to Cornell Athletics and the planning department now that the planning board is no longer an intermediary. And Irene suggested we speak to the code enforcement officer, who will be tasked with enforcing the impossible requirement stipulated in the neg deck that Cornell's artificial turf product not contain or be treated with PFAS. So that was one of the critical internally contradictory aspects of the neg deck. And it's self-evident that this is contradictory. They required a PFAS-free product, but they're also allowing tire crumb, which everyone knows has PFAS, and it's a recycled product. So you can't like go to Europe and get a magical recycled tire crumb without PFAS. So there are a number of strong contradictions, and we think Cornell will be open to discussing them with a group of faculty who are joining the outreach. But Irene might be able to speak to some of the leverage we could have with code enforcement or other legal remedies.
I don't know about legal remedies. I think we're pretty boxed in unless, we convince the code officer, and the code officer wants to assert that, as you've identified, that there are PFAS in the stuff that they'll be installing. As you also pointed out in the document, there was some confusion that Cornell and the planning board seemed to be talking past each other. Planning board was saying no PFAS, and Cornell was saying that they would follow the New York State carpet law, and the carpet law is going to allow some level of PFAS. So the board thought they were getting one thing, and I think that they're not. And so that's unfortunate. I also, though, I want to raise that we didn't get certainly everything we want out of this step, but I really want to commend Bethany and others, Yahweh, I'm not sure, I never say her name right, anyhow, for their efforts in educating the planning board about PFAS, because it was something that wasn't on their radar. They didn't know to think about, and now they do. And that's big, because there's obviously going to be many other instances where PFAS are a concern, and increasingly so as things go forward. So, it wasn't the 100% victory that we wanted, but I think that there's a lot that was accomplished, and I really commend you for your efforts.
We're
I
also,
want to say one more thing, and then we can move on to other topics. But, requirement of seekers to do look at the long range, short range impacts. And they did no life cycle assessment of, producing the plastics, extracting the gas, in relationship to a grass field. They refused to consider any of the seeker provisions, and it was more like a subjective analysis and how they felt about different people and so on. And, it's a very applicant-centric process. It doesn't really hear from the public, nor are they interested in getting independent third-party information from scientists. They had all their science mediated through a landscape architect, and it's so frustrating. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But we can move on to other things. We could fill up the entire remainder of this time with our little bitches, but we're not going to do that, are we?
I think they add up to more than that, Brian, but Martha, you have your hand up.
Yeah, we just appreciate the conversation. I want to take a minute and pull back out to the state level,
Yeah.
which is that in the people don't think about the state budget and the executive plans until January when they become public. But the fall is when all of her agencies are working on their budgets, their proposals, all of that is structured. And the fall is really a critical time to try to influence policy. The Climate Superfund Act, and Brian and I have gone back and forth about this a bunch of times, and she's not going to sign anything controversial before the election. And as a recovering politician, I don't blame her for that. But we need to be ready after November 5th to push hard to get her to sign the Climate Superfund Act, and to strengthen her commitments. The supposed commitment to the HEAT Act, Lisa, we can talk later. And to put things in the budget, the basic state budget that actually are going to support these initiatives. I worry, big picture about the push for nuclear has to do with AI and Bitcoin and all the huge demands for computing power. And she's looking for a way to supposedly solve that equation. So there are a lot of things going on, but I think that we really need to, as a community, as a state, focus on the next couple of months and try to influence, work the refs before the game is called. That's, you try to do that before January, not, it's much harder to do it after.
Yeah, Martha, I agree. One of the last times that Anna Kellis spoke to us, she said basically the budget's set in concrete by November, which really took me aback. I didn't realize that things moved that fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
So,
believe it. And maybe we can pull Anna into a meeting soon to sort of pick her brain on these things.
yeah, I was hoping we could get her to come to our October meeting, because then we don't meet again until early December. So I'll reach out to her staff. Brian.
Yeah, I just, Martha, I volunteered you for a NISAC webinar that they agreed to do on Superfund with their membership. NISAC is most counties in New York State are Republican, I mean, there's a few centers of Democratic control in upstate New York, but most of them are Republican. And so they agreed to do a webinar for their membership. I volunteered you and Jen Metzger, and we're going to be reaching out for some more moderate Republican voices, hopefully, to do this webinar. I just wanted to let you know. I was going to tell you, but here you go.
I was part of that meeting and heard Brian raise the suggestion that Martha participate, and I was egging Brian on, saying it would be great to get you involved.
Thanks, kids. All right, so we'll talk later.
Well, you do have a really solid perspective on this, based on all your previous experience and also the ability, I think, to not lose sight of the big picture. So you would be a good person for that, I think. So the question is then, what do we do to help make sure that the scoping plan, which is rooted in the CLCPA, makes more headway in terms of getting its recommendations implemented? And we've touched on some of that, and it seems that there are some very important pieces of legislation, especially the New York Heat Act, and just want to make sure that as we move forward, that folks participate in that, and that's part of why I'm urging people to sign up for the webinar on false solutions that both Lisa and Irene have referred to. And just, a reminder in particular that TCCPI is a member of the New York Renews campaign, the Renewable Heat Now campaign, which just had its kickoff and has another meeting in October, as well as Climate Can't Wait. And then Brian and I have been participating in the strategy sessions around getting the governor to sign the Climate Change Superfund Act, signed by the governor. But this is represented a new direction for TCCPI over the last few years, that we have become more of an advocacy coalition than we were previously, and to be an effective advocate, we need folks to be participating in the opportunities to get this legislation supported and implemented. And you know, there's a core here of folks that are doing that, but I want to urge other folks to get more involved as well. This is going to be a critical session, and as I think I mentioned in the agenda that went out, the governors and the speaker are not going to have the excuse of, well, we've got an election coming up. We'll have had the election. Hopefully it's not a complete disaster. And so with that behind us, it's all the more important to make sure that we keep the pressure up on the governor and on the assembly. I think the Senate is less problematic. And Lisa, please correct me if I've got that wrong.
No, that's 100% right. We've had such incredible support in the Senate, especially the leadership of Liz Krueger, of course, but also the Senate leadership, like Andrew Stewart Cousins has been, has really come over to be a big supporter. So we're doing great in the Senate. And
Liz Krueger has a great staff too. You know, that's my impression.
That is unbelievable. And if you guys want a real treat, here's a little known fact. Look up the New Students Grassroots Band, which is her energy and climate staff for Justin's Grassroots Band on YouTube. And you're in for an incredibly enjoyable experience. They're very, very good. And they have a new holiday album out. So little pitch for that.
Maybe you could put that link or links into chat, Lisa.
Yeah, but she's you know, sort of my hero. And the world's, you know, she's so wise, she's so strategic, she's so hilarious and fierce and brave. I wish we could all be Liz Krueger.
Brian.
Yeah. So it's clear that nothing is going to be happening in terms of bill signings by the governor prior to the election, but there's going to be a big push right after the election. We don't want to get into the end of December and her sending chapter amendments that the sponsors have to agree to. You know,
You want to explain that a little bit, Brian, because it's not something that everybody's necessarily familiar with, the whole process of chapter amendments.
Yeah, well, it's when the governor wants to change the bill to meet her needs, and she asked the sponsors to agree to change the bill that was passed in their houses, and the sponsors have to decide whether to change them or not. And then there's a lot on the carpet law. We had a lot of pushback. She wanted to weaken that, and we were able to hold off. The sponsors held strong. But I just want to say this week, during Climate Week, our coalition delivered 127,000 petition signatures to the governor's office in New York City. So, you know, we're still doing things, but hopefully everybody will be ready to come out and support us after the election.
Absolutely. And also, just to point this out, that's the petition that I shared with folks a couple of times via email. And I hope at least some of you did sign that petition. It was one of the action, what's that called, Brian? The Action
Network or what?
Yeah, Action Network platform, which is really good. But I mean, just think about that, 127,000 signatures. And from all over the state. I don't think this was just a New York City kind of phenomenon. Martha.
Yeah, I actually think the actual assembly is much more ready to join the Senate on these issues than the leadership is. I would point out Crystal People-Stokes is long-term assembly member from the Buffalo area, and I think there's a sense that what's the name of that gas company?
National Fuel Gas.
National Fuel, she and probably Hochul are, see that as a big business that they need to protect, blah, blah, blah. The only gas-only utility, whereas the others, like NYSEG, have an electric side too. So you don't, theoretically you can still stay in business if you electrify compared to the National Fuel. So I think there's room for the assembly to push back on the speaker. I would point out that the governor's poll numbers seem to be, the lowest point they've ever been. I think she is, and she's got to be starting to look at reelection. So I really do hope that this late fall we can really make a big push, and because I think she's vulnerable and she really needs to be listening to the left side of her brain, not just the right side.
And the polling numbers show her less favorably seen by New Yorkers than Trump. She's at 34, he's at 39.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're talking about approval ratings here, and they
Yeah.
are pretty hard to ignore.
yeah.
Any other folks want to weigh in? I think one of the reasons why I wanted to have Bob join us today was not just for the direct purpose of updating us on his work regarding blue hydrogen, LNG, and methane emissions, but also just to remind folks about the extent to which, and this has been pointed out already, but I think it bears repeating, the extent to which Bob really led the charge on the scoping plan, and it is clearly a disappointment in terms of how slowly those recommendations are getting implemented. But it's up to the rest of us to really get behind Bob and the Climate Action Council and make sure that we continue to progress on that front, because the climate news isn't getting any better, that's for sure. And just if we need any kind of reminder, the hurricane that's pounding the Big Bend in Florida this morning, and then will move into southern Appalachia, and clearly is going to be a major threat there with flash flooding. And even though the wind's going to be down by then, it's the and this also has the potential to move north again and cause the kind of damage in the Hudson River Valley and in Vermont that's already been knocked around a couple of times in the last year or so. I mean, Bob, one of the things that caught my attention was you mentioned that at the current pace, we're zooming not just past 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees centigrade, but we're well on our if we keep this up, well on our way to 4 or 5 degrees centigrade increase. Was I right in hearing that?
Yeah, I think probably not 4 to 5, but we're on target. We're at 1.4. going to be consistently above 1.5 within the next 2 to 3 years. We'll be breaking 2 degrees pretty consistently in current trajectories within 10 years, plus or minus a couple of years. Beyond that, most of the models are suggesting we'll end up at around 3.5, probably not higher than that.
Okay.
But 2 is hugely damaging. You know, back in December 2015 for COP21 in Paris, you know, the nations agreed that 1.5 was dangerous, and then you'd start to see more extreme climate stuff at 1.5, and of course we are. And they said that keeping it well below 2 was the target, and then that target was set because the scientific community is saying, as you reach through 2, the risk of hitting thresholds in the climate system, which were irreversible on the timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years, becomes greater. And, you know, the sort of things we're talking about there are fundamental changes in ocean circulation, fundamental loss of vegetation in the Amazon, loss of boreal forests in Canada and Siberia, all of which are, you know, devastating and really hard to counteract. And, you know, we're starting to see some of those things now. Back in 2015, when nations agreed to that and the scientific community was saying that, you know, I and others were saying there's a real risk of changes, say, in the North Atlantic ocean circulation. Well, we're now seeing it. You know, the North Atlantic deep water formation, the currents have slowed by about 15 to 17% over the last 15 years. And that's part of the reason we're getting this bizarre weather. It's part of the reason the Gulf of Mexico is so hot right now. It's part of the reason this hurricane intensified so quickly. It also slows the rate of ocean uptake of carbon dioxide, and 25% historically of the carbon dioxide that we've emitted from fossil fuels over the last century has been taken up by oceans. But when you slow the ocean sinking, you slow that uptake as well. And so you run on these a real risk of runaway feedbacks that will really be devastating to, say, agriculture. So that's the reason for the target, and it's not looking good, you know, quite frankly.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, though. I hadn't thought about the fact that the slowing of these currents made it difficult to keep up the current level of greenhouse gas emission uptake in the ocean.
Yeah, no, it's that's a real factor. As we burn the boreal forests more extensively in Canada, that puts more carbon dioxide in. We're slowing the carbon dioxide uptake by Amazon. I mean, all of this cascades some of the sort of ways that nature have been mitigating what humans have been doing, and makes it worse. And those are the sorts of things that the scientific community is long worried about, and that they're looking more immediate and real.
Bob, are you going to COP29?
No, I'm not. I might, yeah, no. I was at COP21. I've gone to a couple of others. I think at COP21, I don't know if I made a difference or not, but there's a momentum of scientists there who, you know, I was one of maybe 200 that probably collectively helped push that messaging through. But the COPs I've gone to since have been more marketing and more controlled, and it's hard to get excited about going to ones that are in oil producing countries and controlled by the industry.
Yeah, that's I think pretty apparent that the whole process there is really broken down, and the so little progress being made internationally in terms of figuring out how to slow down the rate of these emissions, never mind eliminating them. And it's not clear to me what alternatives there are internationally, I guess, except for maybe bilateral agreements.
Well, and some individual countries are making progress, right? And to me, you know, I mean, what we do in New York, I actually do think is critical, because we're a huge economy, and if we can demonstrate that one can move to a fossil fuel economy here in New York and make it work in a way that's good for our citizens and our economy, well, that'll be shatteringly important globally, I think, and I really do. I mean, that's what keeps me optimistic is and when I hear that it's just too difficult politically, then of course I get depressed again. But I do think it's possible. I think our climate law puts us on the right target, and I think if we actually make it work, it will be of global significance.
Yeah, and that also helps explain why the fossil fuel industry has been so focused on slowing down that process in New York. And of course, at the same time, underscores the importance of everyone here getting involved in supporting the legislation that's implementing the CLCP, like New York Heat. Martha.
Yeah, Bob, I think you really, it's so clear you have made such a difference. I mean, even if the EPA hasn't formally accepted the 20-year time frame, you hear more and more and more reporters and politicians talking about methane, talking about 20-year time frame, talking about 86 times more warming potential than CO2. You really have changed the conversation. And I think, as somebody wrote in the chat, the evidence is clear in the size of the bullseye on your back, and Tony, and I don't know how Renee Santoro got off without that, but
not just the size of the target, but the fact that it's painted in fluorescent colors that glow in the dark when Bob's walking around.
Don't tell me this.
No, I think you
Thank
should.
you.
Yeah, no. Keep on keeping on, because we need this kind of solid, unimpeachable research, that can stand up to 16 reviewers and all the rest. And I think the advocacy, the role of scientists now, understanding you have to also be public speakers and public advocates, is also a sea change, and you've been leading on that front as well. So thank you for
Well, thank you.
everything.
I view myself as part of a community of scientists who do that, but no one scientist could do it alone. You couldn't stand it, but there are many people doing it. But thank you.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important for folks like us who know what's going on and are engaged. Why it's so important for folks to really step it up over the next few months. As I said before, it really is going to be critical, and I think will help shape how we go forward for not just this coming session, but for years after. Okay, so any other final comments? I will be sending out the recording when I get the link from Zoom. I will also be sharing the chat log. And Bob, would you be willing to share your slide deck? Because I would include that as well if you are.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah, you probably want to correct the year.
If that's the only error in there, I'm doing well.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. Really appreciate your spending time with us today, Bob, and also really appreciate everything that all of you are doing to stay engaged, not just at the state level, but as Dan reminded us the last time, at the local level.